The Rolling Stones, British rock group, formed in 1962, that drew on Chicago blues stylings to create a unique vision of the dark side of post-1960s counterculture. The original members were Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Brian Jones, Bill Wyman, and Charlie Watts. Later members were Mick Taylor, Ron Wood, and Darryl Jones. No rock band has sustained consistent activity and global popularity for so long a period as the Rolling Stones, still capable, more than 50 years after their formation, of filling the largest stadia in the world. Though several of their mid-1960s contemporaries, notably Bob Dylan, Paul McCartney, Eric Clapton, and Van Morrison, have maintained individual positions in rock's front line, the Rolling Stones' nucleus of singer Jagger, guitarist Richards, and drummer Watts remains rock's most durable ongoing partnership. In the process, the Stones have become rock's definitive, emblematic band, a seamless blend of sound, look, and public image. It may be debatable whether they have actually, at any given moment, been the greatest rock and roll band in the world, as their time-honored onstage introduction has claimed them to be, that they are the mold from which various generations of challengers from The Who, Led Zeppelin, and Aerosmith via the New York Dolls, The Clash, and the Sex Pistols all the way to Guns N' Roses and Oasis have been struck as not. In their onstage personae, Jagger and Richards established the classic rock band archetypes, the preening, narcissistic singer and the haggard, obsessive guitarist. Formed in London as an alliance between Jagger, Richards, and multi-instrumentalist Brian Jones along with Watts and bassist Wyman, the Stones began as a grubby conclave of students and bohemians playing a then esoteric music based on Chicago blues in pubs and clubs in and around West London. Their potential for mass-market success seemed negligible at first, but by 1965 they were second only to the Beatles in the collective affection of teenage Britain. However, whereas the Beatles of the mid-1960s had longish hair, wore matching suits, and appeared utterly charming, the Stones had considerably longer hair, all dressed differently, and seemed thoroughly intimidating. As the Beatles grew ever more respectable and reassuring, the Stones became correspondingly more rebellious and threatening. The Stones, specifically Jagger, Richards, and Jones, were subjected to intense police and press harassment for drug use and all-purpose degeneracy, whereas the Beatles, who were in private life no less fond of marijuana, sex, and alcohol, were welcomed at Buckingham Palace and made members of the Order of the British Empire, MBE, by the Queen. The Stones' early repertoire consisted primarily of recycled gems from the catalogues of the blues and rock and roll titans of the 1950s. Their first 5 singles, and the bulk of their first 2 albums, were composed by others. The turning point was reached when, spurred on by the example of the Beatles' John Lennon and Paul McCartney, Jagger and Richards began composing their own songs, which not only ensured the long-term viability of the band, but also served to place the Jagger-Richards team firmly in creative control of the group. Jones had been their prime motivating force in their early days, and he was the band's most gifted instrumentalist as well as its prettiest face, but he had little talent for composition and became increasingly marginalized. His textural wizardry dominated their first all-original album, Aftermath, 1966, which featured him on marimba, dulcimer, sitar, and assorted keyboards as well as on his customary guitar and harmonica. Thereafter, however, he declined in both creativity and influence, becoming a depressive, drug-sodden liability eventually fired by the band mere weeks before his death. The Jagger-Richards songwriting team created its first bona fide classic, I Can't Get No Satisfaction, in 1965, and enjoyed a string of innovative hit singles well into 1966, including Painted Black, 19th Nervous Breakdown, Get Off My Cloud, Have You Seen Your Mother, Baby, and Lady Jane. But the era of art pop and psychedelia, which coincided with the Beatles' creative peak, represented a corresponding trough for the Stones. The fashions of the era of whimsy and flower power did not suit their essentially dark and disruptive energies, and their psychedelic album Their Satanic Majesty's Request, 1967, with its accompanying single We Love You, was a comparatively feeble riposte to the Beatles' all-conquering Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and contributed little beyond its title to their legend. Furthermore, they were hampered by seemingly spending as much time in court and jail as they did in the studio or on tour. However, as the mood of the time darkened, the Stones hit a new stride in 1968 with the epical single Jumpin' Jack Flash, which reconnected them to their blues rock roots, and the album Beggar's Banquet. Replacing Jones with the virtuosic but self-effacing guitarist Mick Taylor, they returned to the road in 1969, almost instantly becoming rock's premier touring attraction. By the end of 1970, the Beatles had broken up, Jimi Hendrix was dead, and Led Zeppelin had barely appeared on the horizon. Though Led Zeppelin eventually outsold the Stones by 5 albums to 1, no group could challenge their central position in the rock pantheon. Moreover, the death of Brian Jones combined with Taylor's lack of onstage presence elevated public perception of Richard's status from that of Jagger's right-hand man to effective co-leader of the band. The period between Jumpin' Jack Flash and the double album Exile on Main Street, 1972, remains their creative and iconic peak. Including the studio albums Let It Bleed, 1969, and Sticky Fingers, 1971, plus the in-concert Get Your Ya-Ya's Out. 1970, it gave them the repertoire and image that still defines them, and on which they have continued to trade ever since, an incendiary blend of sex, drugs, Satanism, and radical politics delivered with their patented fusion of Jagger's ironic distance and Richard's tattered Amalian intensity. Their records and concerts at this time both explored and provided the soundtrack for the contradictions of a collapsing counterculture at a time when almost everybody else, The Doors, the Velvet Underground, and Frank Zappa's mothers of invention accepted, still seemed to be in a state of psychedelic euphoria. Produced first by Glyn Johns and Jimmy Miller, and then by Jagger and Richards themselves, as the Glimmer Twins, their recordings of this period found them adding Count-TL music to their list of influences, and most notably on Beggar's Banquet adding more and more acoustic guitar textures to their already impressive command of musical light and shade. Yet their blues-powered foray into the era's heart of darkness bore bitter fruit indeed, when a young black man was murdered by Hell's Angels, hired as security, at a disastrous free concert at the Altamont Speedway in Livermore, California, during their 1969 American tour. It seemed to many observers that the Stones' own aura of decadence and danger was somehow to blame for the tragedy. The quality of their music began to decline after Exile on Main Street. Jagger and Richards began to act out the group's fascination with the juxtaposition of high society and low life. The singer became a jet-set figure, the guitarist, a full-time junkie who finally cleaned up in 1977 and thereby saved both his own life and the band's future. Taylor left in 1975 to be replaced by Wood, formerly of the Faces, and, despite the occasional bright spot like Some Girls, 1978, Emotional Rescue, 1980, or Start Me Up, 1981, the Stones' albums and singles became increasingly predictable, though their tours continued to sell out. They even briefly disbanded in the late 1980s after a public spat between Jagger and Richards. Both leaders recorded solo albums that performed relatively poorly in the marketplace, though Richards' work was significantly more favorably reviewed than Jagger's. Disputes settled, the Stones reconvened in 1989 for their Steel Wheels album and tour. Wyman retired in 1992 and was replaced on tour by Darryl Jones, formerly a bassist for Miles Davis and Sting, and in the studio by a variety of guest musicians. Jagger, Richards, Watts, and Wood continued to trade as the Rolling Stones, and, whenever they toured, audiences flocked in the thousands to discover if the old lions could still roar. The general consensus was that they could. In their late middle age, the Ultimate Rebels became the ultimate institution, and to many they remained the ultimate rock band. In 2021, Watts died, and a month later the band launched an American tour with Steve Jordan on drums. Several prominent film directors sought to translate the electricity of the Stones as live performers to the screen, including Jean-Luc Godard, with the impressionistic Sympathy for the Devil, 1968, Hal Ashby, with Let's Spend the Night Together, 1982, and, perhaps most notably, David Maysles, Albert Maysles, and Charlotte Swearin, with Gimme Shelter, 1970, which covered the group's 1969 tour and Altamont Speedway concert. More recently, in the wake of the group's well-received album A Bigger Bang, 2005, director Martin Scorsese, long a fan of the group, focused less on the spectacle of a Stones concert and more on the band as performers. The result, Shine a Light, 2008, met with critical acclaim and confirmed that the Rolling Stones were still a major presence in the rock scene of the 21st century. In 2012, the band celebrated its 50th anniversary with concerts in England and the United States. That year also saw the release of the retrospective documentary Crossfire Hurricane. In 2016, the Rolling Stones returned to their beginnings for their first studio album in 11 years, Blue V. Lonesome, an assemblage of Chicago blues covers that won the Grammy Award for Best Traditional Blues Album. This was only the second album by the band to win a Grammy and came more than 2 decades after the first, when Voodoo Lounge, 1994, took the award for Best Rock Album. The Rolling Stones received a Grammy Award for Lifetime Achievement in 1987, and 2 years later they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. In 2003, Jagger was knighted by Prince Charles.